Okay, today what we're going to do is mix this hybrid orchestration project that we did in the last series of videos. So there's a lot of different things going on here. I'm gonna move between this window and the mix window. So the mix window is going to be here, and I'm going to show you every single step along the way of that. So first thing that I would do here, if I already have everything written how I want it to, or how I think I want it written right now, what I'm going to do is get all of the extra stuff essentially out of the way, because there's a lot of extra tracks and stuff that I did not use here. And that's just because I load up a template with a lot of different tracks and articulations and everything to have everything preloaded, so I don't have to add new instruments all the time when I'm writing. So in Cubase, there's a feature for this where you can just go up here and set track visibility. And so I like to do show tracks with data between the locators, meaning the locators here and here. So it will only now show me anything with data between the locators. And so suddenly I have all of my tracks visible. So you can see that we actually have, I don't know, 20, 30 tracks or something like that. Technically, there are a few things missing here, which is the reverbs and all of that. But we're gonna go very basic step by step on everything. So my first goal with orchestral mixing is to make sure that I have everything routed in a way to where it makes grouping easier. So a bus, or a group as it's called in Cubase, is where multiple things go into and sum together into one controllable fader. So the goal here is to sum everything into groups and buses so we can control them. The way that I do my mixing typically is I split my orchestra into highs and lows. So I do high winds and low winds, high brass, low brass. And then for percussion, I actually typically split it high pitched percussion, low pitched percussion. And then for unpitched, I split it three ways: high, mid, and low for unpitched. And then for strings, high strings, low strings. And for synthetic stuff, typically I don't bus that unless it's actually intended to be one sound together. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and set those buses. Technically, in my template, I already have these built. So I'm just going to go ahead and make these visible. I already have them built, and they're already color coordinated. So high woodwinds, low woodwinds, high brass, etc. Everything that I just said right there. Technically, we don't need choir because we didn't use choir for anything. So I'll just go ahead and remove that. So what we do need to do, though, is we need to make sure that everything is routed properly. So I'm going to open up my mix window. And in my mix window, I'm going to do the same thing that I did before, where I want to only show tracks with data between the locators, so I don't have to deal with too much here. And then I'm going to take we're color coordinated here, so anything that is from piccolo down to like clarinet, I typically consider as a high woodwind. So if we had a bass clarinet or something like that, that would be a low woodwind. But anything from piccolo to clarinet, I consider high woodwind. Oh, actually, I'm incorrect here. Apparently, in my template, I have clarinets typically go to low woodwinds. I don't think that's what I want here because I don't consider clarinets to be a low woodwind. It is a mid-range instrument, so it's going to be up to y'all, obviously, but in this situation, I actually think I want it in the highs. So typically, if this wasn't a preloaded template, what this would say is all of these would be going to the stereo out, meaning they're just going to like the master bus that's allowing you to hear everything. But I'm going to have them all go to the high woodwinds group. And then for all of my bassoon articulations, those are all going to go to the low woodwinds. Then I typically consider French horn and trumpets as my high brass, and I consider trombones, both tenor and bass trombones, as low brass. You can see that I've already routed them there, along with the tuba, of course. Here we've got tubular bells. That's going to be pitched percussion. Timpani would typically be a low or large pitch percussion. That's exactly what I have it here as, large pitch percussion. Timpani is actually typically the only large pitch percussion I have, but there is a group for it in case there is something synthetic doing that. Then we have anything red here is going to be our percussion. This actually didn't get colored. I believe that's our hi-hat. So anything right here is going to be percussion, and looks like I already have most of it grouped. These are all going into the mids. I don't think I necessarily want the taikos as mids. Maybe I do. Let me go listen to them real quick. Sometimes I'll have to listen to the stuff to see how I use them. Yeah, so I made them a mid instrument by cutting out a lot of their low frequency. Let's check the toms. I might mix the toms as a large instrument this time, so I'm going to mix it as a large unpitched. And then the dark impacts here, what are these? That's definitely large, so I want to make sure that that's routed to large. And then the 808 hi-hat, I'm going to color this slightly different just so I know. That's going to be like a high or a small unpitched percussion. And realistically, that's probably true for the cymbals as well, but I think we can leave them in mid. Let me just make sure we're not missing anything else here. Cymbals, bass drum. Where's my bass drum going? Is that going? That's going to mid for some reason, so that translated incorrectly. 600-pound Nagado ensemble, that's going to be large. Action strike taikos, we already did those are mid. So yeah, I think everything else now, because the reason that matters is because of how I'm going to EQ the high frequency and the low frequency instruments later, and I want to make sure that they are EQ'd appropriately in a group. So let's look at these. That's definitely going to be high or mid. We've got them in mid, so let's just leave them in mid for now. Perfect. Then we've got the harp and the piano. Harp and piano often will just go directly to the master or mix bus, which is what I have here. And I technically create a master mix bus separate from my stereo out. Don't ask me why. I started doing that a long time ago because, I don't know, maybe I was told don't put things on the stereo out, which is crazy because that's like an old school way to think, because it's the same thing as the master bus, and people would say don't put things on your master bus. People do it now all the time. But because I do that, because I do have a separate master bus that everything goes to before it goes to the stereo out, which actually this should be going there too. Because I do it that way, it actually gives me more room for mastering chains and stuff here before it gets to the stereo out. And then on the stereo out, I can put things like Insight and check my levels and whatnot. So those are, I'm just going to send directly there. And then all of my anything viola or violin through viola is going to be in high strings. Cellos and basses going to be in low strings. Everything else here that is synthetic is just going to go directly to the mix master bus, and we are good to go from there. Now, part of the problem with this track in particular that I talked about last time when we were writing it is I didn't do much gain staging. So gain staging is where you set the levels of your literal gain levels of every instrument beforehand to make sure all the gain is appropriate before you really start mixing with plugins and all of the different things. So when we hit here, watch your ears on this, when we hit here, it just gets like really loud and everything starts peaking and stuff, right? I actually lowered it. I must have lowered it last time. You can see that that's not at 0. But right. And so it just gets super screaming loud. And last time I checked, things were peaking and stuff. Not this time around, but I'm going to be cautious about that anyway. And so what I'm going to do is anything not going to the master, but things going to groups, basically. So all of this stuff, actually, we missed one. Wild Winds, that's just going to go straight to the master because that was a big boomy sound. That's all it was. Anything here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to lower the overall gain. A typical number that I've heard a lot of people say is -12. And while I haven't had, so because I don't have a lot of inserts and plugins here in the chain and stuff, what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to lower the gain before it hits the plugins as pre-gain. Now that's going to function a little bit differently for that kind of stuff, but I don't think it's going to mess it up too much. So anything that's anything here that's an actual instrument that's not a group is going to get a little bit of pre-gain adjustment. So I'm just going to, on the pre-gain, lower all of them. I don't think I need to go all the way to -12 here. Let's just do like -9. But typically I would have it at like -12. And that's really annoying to write like that when it preloads at -12 or whatever, because everything's just so freaking quiet and you have to turn all of your equipment way up to hear anything that's going on. So now everything's going to be way, way, way quieter. And so it's going to be slightly harder to work with. But now that everything here is pre-gained appropriately, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my buses, which are not visible right now. So here's all my buses that I showed you earlier. Don't do that. Oh, messed that up. Show all channels. Show channels visible between locators, and then add these as well. And then add my effects channels and my master bus. So we've got over here, these are all of our buses, and they're color coordinated, and everything is now being sent to them. So if we hit play, that's just our high winds, low winds, brass. We've got our pitch percussion, etc., etc. You get the picture. So in a very basic analysis of mixing, what I would do, the concept is for mixing that everything needs its own space in the frequency spectrum, and everything needs to be heard, everything needs to be slotting in to a certain range, everything needs to be dynamic and moving but also be audible. That's the general mix idea. It's like, it's a blend. How do you hear everything? Have things not conflict? Now there's a lot of different mentalities in mixing. You can run into phasing issues, you can run into like nodes piling up and building and becoming problems. You can deal with low frequencies becoming issues, all of those things. So I'm going to show you a very, very basic setup here for orchestral hybrid scoring. This is how I typically start, and then I start getting into the really nitty-gritty details, which we probably won't get into today, but we shall see. So anything that's in the high frequency range, I don't need low frequencies in it, because the low frequencies, I'm talking the low lows, the subs, right? Anything like 120 below is going to actually cause more problems than be good for my high instruments. And we can show it here actually. It's very interesting. If I solo my high woodwinds, you can see that there's still some frequency down there. We don't really need that or want that, because what's going to happen is it's going to pile up and then cause issues in the bottom with like just all sorts of conglomerate stuff, and you're never going to have your subs hit hard or anything like that, because generally the sub frequencies, you want to use them sparingly so that when they do hit, you feel them and they're not just rumbling the entire time. It's like when people are you hear people blasting music in their car going down the street, you hear that kick and that bass hitting really hard, right? Well, if the sub was just going all the time because there's a whole bunch of sub frequencies down there that aren't tamed, you're going to have a lot of issues, and it's just going to be like the whole time, and you really don't want that. So anything that's a high frequency or a high frequency instrument definitely doesn't need its lows, because we are trying to make space. We're making room for everything else. So what I've done is I've done a high pass filter here, which this means it lets the highs pass through. So the lows are cut, and I've sort of softened the curve of it a little bit with just like a bell right here to soften the curve of it and the edge of it. I'm going to take that setting and I'm going to apply it to anything that's in the high range. Even the small percussion and the mid percussion, I'm going to do that too. And then anything here for high strings, etc. You'll see there's a bunch of extra plugins here loaded. I'm just going to go ahead and delete those. Those were plugins that were already preloaded. So we've got that for our highs, our smalls, etc. And then realistically, even for, I'm going to copy this over to my low woodwinds. Even for my low woodwinds, I'm still going to cut some of those low frequencies. I'm just probably not going to cut them as much because we want some of that low resonance, and chances are the fundamental of the note, meaning where the note actually, like if you play a G, the G fundamental is probably going to be in a little bit lower space, so we don't want to lose all that low resonance. It's the same thing you would do with vocalists. You don't want to, if you have a bass singer, you don't want to necessarily cut out all of the bass resonance of their voice. And so we're going to do the same thing, but we are going to cut out some of the subs, because the subs are not going to do a whole lot for us. So we're going to do that for our pitch percussion, probably not our large pitch percussion, and probably not our large unpitched percussion, but we are going to do it for our high strings and our low strings. Fundamentally, philosophically, the things that should be hitting in the sub frequencies are the massive percussive hits and anything that's like sub bass, which we will talk about later, which is all of basically this stuff. So now that we've got that, from a basic standpoint, we've got our orchestra. With our orchestra, this is just the orchestra right here. Everything else, like all this purple stuff right here, that's all synthetic stuff, right? So everything else is basically orchestra, except for some of the unpitched percussion that's like hybrid unpitched, but we can make all that work. So from here, what I would do is I would make sure that I don't have a whole bunch of reverb going on with any of my other instruments, like on the instrument channel itself. You don't want to go to, say, your trombones and have a whole bunch of reverb here. Now, BBC is already typically wet. There's already some reverb on it. I often will add reverb to the reverb of the BBC, and it's not a big deal. That's a personal taste thing. But what I would not do almost ever, unless it's for an actual effect, is I wouldn't take my viola pizzicatos and then go and add an actual reverb to them on the insert as a plugin and then have that going to the group. That's going to cause a lot of problems. And the reason you don't do that is because then you're going to have to load the reverb plugin 18 million times on all of your other articulations, instruments, etc. And you're going to be wearing out your processor, and you also actually have less control over the reverb at that point. So the general philosophy for reverb is reverb should always be on a bus or an effects track or an aux track, depending on what your audio workstation is or what kind of console board or whatever you're using. Sometimes they'll call it a bus, aux, or effects track. In Cubase, it's an effects track. So what I have over here is many different effects tracks that are already preloaded that are my reverbs. So I have East West Studios for one convolution reverb. I have Revelation for an algorithmic reverb. And then I have some extra fancy ones like Vast and ROM that are like little color things that I'll add occasionally, stuff like that. And then I actually have a distortion on a bus as well. So these reverbs, if you look at the effects chain, are literally just a reverb. That's the core sound. And then they have an EQ before them and an EQ after them. I don't typically always recommend having an EQ before and after. You almost always want to cut the lows of a reverb out for the same reasons you cut the lows of the reverb out for your normal instruments. You just don't want that reflection piling up in those low frequencies. But sometimes you don't even want those lows hitting the reverb. It's going to be a shimmer mixing taste. Over time, your ears will grow to say, okay, this reverb has too many highs in it, too many mids in it. The idea is that we are EQing the reverb separately from how we are EQing the instrument, because the reverb can sound differently as well. So we have our orchestra. Bear with me. We have our orchestra. Now, all we are going to do is turn on a certain amount of reverb. All of these are going to my East West Studios convolution reverb, and you will now see when I hit play, they're sending here. They're sending at a certain level that's controllable. So I'll show you the control as we go through it. So that's pretty extreme, right? So I'm going to bring it down. General rule for reverb is do less than you think you want, because most people want too much reverb. My problem as a composer, I found, was I actually always used too little reverb because I was told use less than you want. So nowadays I actually use a little bit more than I want because I have to be aware of that. So for an orchestra, what people typically do is go to a convolution reverb, which is a reverb that actually is sampled of a real hall. This one's called New York String Hall. It has a response of 3.4 seconds, which means the note is going to ring basically for 3.4 seconds. And this convolution reverb, East-West Spaces, is a particular reverb that I have, but all digital audio workstations have built-in reverbs these days that are very, very, very good, so you don't need to use the fancy ones. So I have it set to a convolution reverb, which is an actual sampled hall. So I'm effectively putting my orchestra in a hall. This is really important if you're using different samples from different libraries. they are recorded in different halls, and so you want them all to be put into the same hall. In this situation, I think I used BBC across the board. I may have used East-West for the harp or something like that. But what I'm going to do is send them to a hall. So this is the actual hall that they're going to sit in. And then I'm going to have them all go to a little bit of algorithmic reverb. Algorithmic reverb is reverb that is completely artificial. It's done by an algorithm. It is not a sampled room. And with the algorithmic reverb, it's just for a little bit of extra color, a little bit of extra flair, a little bit of extra spice. So I'm going to solo all of my, I can solo all of my, I don't know why that's only soloing one. So I'm going to solo all of these and have them play a little bit so I can hear them all and get my reverb levels correct. Then I'm going to turn on my algorithmic reverb. Okay, so it's going to be balanced somewhere around there. We've got a good starting point here. By the way, when you are creating your reverb effects bus or aux track, in this situation, you want it to be no dry at all, 0% dry and 100% wet, so that you'll see it as a mix knob on some of them as 100% wet, right? So that you are not sending any dry signal through that. You are only getting the wet signal from the reverb. Now that we're here, the next steps generally that I would do as just a starting point would be compression. But before I'm going to do compression, I'm going to go ahead and get my overall levels being okay. So I'm just going to listen to the orchestra from the beginning and see if there's anything in particular that I'm like, this is a little too quiet, I don't really like this. And we're going to gain stage just a little bit. So right now, my mid percussion is too loud in comparison to everything else. I think my brass is slightly too loud, especially the low brass. I'm just changing the bus right now. I'm doing very, very basic levels. This is basic mixing. Let me bring it up a little bit. I'm actually gonna gain up my high strings just a little bit here. Okay, right now, that hi-hat, I can tell I don't want that hi-hat hitting my small percussion group because it's hitting the reverb. So I'm actually going to go ahead and just send this to the mix master bus and treat this as a hybrid element, which it technically is. Right, so we've got to start here. We've got a rough start. So now I'm going to get out of solo territory. I'm done doing solo territory. We're going to start mixing with the full ensemble with everything happening here because we've got way more elements than that. So While this plays, as a general rule for compression, I would actually just start, even if your ears can't hear compression yet, it's a good idea to reduce your dynamic level down a little bit across the board so that, or your dynamic range. It's a good idea to reduce the dynamic range a little bit in this type of setting so that you don't have extreme dynamic ranges. Orchestral music, film scoring, video game music, all that kind of stuff typically has a much larger dynamic range than a pop song, but compression is still used. And so the general rule with compression is that you use a small amount of compression at multiple stages in the chain. So what that means is you may have something like EQ, compressor, saturator, EQ, compressor, sent to another bus, a little bit of compression, another EQ, etc., etc. But you want a small amount of compression to just grab the top parts throughout to bring the dynamic level or the dynamic range down and make everything a little bit just closer together so that it sounds louder and more full, right? You want to do that on basically all of the buses is typically how I do it. You can do it however, but for ease, I do it on the buses. So in this situation, I'm going to use not the compressor that I would normally use. I would normally use analog hardware, like hardware emulation stuff like an LA2A or a 1176 or something. But for you guys, I want you guys to be able to see the basic parameters of a compressor. So I'm going to use the stock compressor in Cubase, which is going to be totally fine. And so what we're looking for is we're going to lower the threshold. The threshold is when the compressor hits. So I guess I'll just explain what a compressor is for those of you who don't know. A compressor basically says when something hits past a certain dynamic level, anything above that dynamic level is going to get reduced down. And it's going to get reduced down at a certain ratio. That's what's over here. So for example, if it's at -24 and it hits above that and it hits 4 dB above that, and it's a ratio of 2 to 1, it's going to reduce it at a 2 to 1 ratio. So 4 dB is going to be reduced down to 2 dB. So it's not squashing it completely, it's not cutting it off, but it's reducing all of the decibels above it down a little bit at a certain ratio. So 2 is a very, very mild compression. 4 is actually considered pretty mild, kind of moderate compression. You see 4 a lot on vocal chains and stuff. 10, 8, all that is extreme, and you will very much so hear that. So I'm just going to leave this at 2, and I'm just going to set the threshold somewhere to where I can see it hitting a little bit. And part of the thing with a compressor is that once it squashes it down, overall, everything's going to be quieter, right? Well, with that, you want it to do some makeup gain. So the makeup gain is going to bring everything back up. So it squashes the loud stuff, but then makes everything louder so that everything sounds within a more consistent dynamic range. With this particular plugin, it has some makeup gain built in and is automatically doing it for us. So I'm not even going to adjust. So I'm going to just lower it so it hits a little bit. Not much more than that. I'm going to do the same thing over here for the bassoons. I'm just copying the settings. Yeah. Hitting where it should be. Copying the settings to the high brass. Probably hit that one a little bit less. Low brass. Yeah. I actually don't have anything in small percussion anymore, I don't think, because I removed the hi-hat. So everything's on mid, which is totally fine for this project. So we're going to go over here. That's hitting too hard for me. Hitting way too hard there. Okay, so just you see how it's just barely hitting on those levels. So this would be like a starting point for me for my orchestra. Now, theoretically, you might want to go through and do that for everything here too. But we're gonna mix this as we go and make things happen as we go with all of the synthetic stuff. The synthetic stuff is, because it's sound design elements at times, you want to treat it slightly differently. So we've got a basic EQ, we've got a basic compression. If this is all you did in the early stages, you would be okay. Like, this is much better than just throwing it all together and just saying that's it, right? So this like EQ and compression is like 90% of mixing. There's way more EQ and compression that I would do in this along the way, but this is a good start.